This video was sponsored by Skillshare. I really gotta stop skipping my updates because every time I try to record a voiceover, it takes me way too long to get it started, and I seem to forget how I went about it in the past. But anyways, I'm back with another video. Unfortunately missed last week's, but here we are. And I wanted to show you guys the process of this new illustration, and here are some of the inks that I'm using. Actually, I'm just going to be using these four for this particular illustration. I'm not even sure if I ended up using the black, maybe a tiny bit, but I really like these colors, and I wanted to revisit some illustrations that I started ages ago. So I already had the sketches sitting around, maybe like from last year, and so I wanted to take the opportunity to finish them up and in the process recapture some of the look / feel of one of my previous illustrations, which you probably saw was pinned up on the thing at the beginning of the video. But anyways, yeah, so this is my character HaeJin, and this is just like this alternative design / outfit. I'm not really gonna get into what the context of this particular design is exactly because it may be something of a spoiler, so I'm just gonna steer clear of that and mostly talk about the process of this illustration, because there's a couple of things that I noticed about this process that I thought would be kind of interesting to mention, and so I'm just gonna jump right into it. The first thing is that, like I mentioned, I already had these sketches laying around for quite some time that I just never got around to executing. They were initially drawn kind of for fun in conjunction with the planning of the illustrations that I did for my sticker pack called The Traveler. And there's a couple of illustrations that I kind of thought maybe will be sticker designs, but I couldn't really fit them, and I decided to use different ones. So now I just stumbled upon them when I was sorting through some files, and I decided to complete them. And I wanted to use up some of the leftover paper that I've had in this one pad, like a slightly smaller one than the one I've been using lately. And so I decided to print out these sketches and get to work on them. Initially, I was really into the one of the illustrations that I did that is called Suitcase. I really love how that one turned out, and unfortunately I never posted a process video of that particular illustration here because I actually just never recorded it. It was very spontaneous, and I sketched it in marker right onto the paper pad, and I was kind of like frustrated at the time, and so I figured I'm just gonna ignore the things that were really giving me a hard time at the moment, which were recording my process and just being too meticulous about everything other than the actual process of the illustration, which is sort of the situation that I find myself in right now. But I, decided to record this regardless of how I feel about recording at the moment. So long story short, I printed out these sketches and I set out to match the previous suitcase illustration that I did of the same character. And so I picked out the 4 inks that I mostly used for that one illustration. Alright, so before I continue, I want to tell you guys about this really great class I just watched on Skillshare. So firstly, if you've never heard of Skillshare before, it's an online community for people who love to learn new skills and expand their creative interests. I usually check out the illustration and productivity sections because they're the most relevant to my activities, but there are a ton more topics to explore, and each class is broken down into small segments which make it super easy to navigate or break up the time spent if you're super busy. So the class I recently watched is called Gouache Illustration, Paint a Whimsical and Colorful Character by Vanessa Gillings. I'm personally a fan of Vanessa, and I've been following her on Instagram for many years, so watching this class was super interesting and also very informative to me. I'd highly recommend checking it out. She goes into a ton of detail, and she uses gouache in a very unique way that's actually a little bit similar to how I use colored ink in some ways, and so her tips are easily applicable to my own process, and I learned a lot of new little tricks which I am pretty excited to implement into my illustrations. If you want to check out this class and more for free, I have a link in the description with a free trial. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link will get a 1-month free trial to Skillshare, and so I highly recommend you check it out if you are interested. And now back to my video. And I don't know if I've mentioned this before, I probably have, but the inks that I've been using as of late for the past couple of years or so, for the most part, are ones from Rohrer and Klingner. I believe it's like a German brand, and the colors that I specifically used for this illustration are, I'm just gonna look at them right now and list them out. Burnt Sienna is the one that looks pretty red in it's weird because it kind of looks brown in the bottle, but it does come off as very red, and I like this color a lot. It's on the warmer side. Next is Umbra, which is a very warm type of dark brown color, and Sepia, which is still kind of brown but more on the grayish side. So those are the 3 primary colors that I used for this illustration. And for the line art specifically, I kind of mixed a bit of Umbra and Sepia into the ink, and I heavily diluted it with water and tested it a bunch of times just to make sure that it's kind of dark but not too dark, that it will really flatten out the illustration. Usually what I'm looking for is kind of a medium, maybe a little bit darker than a medium tone, so that when I go over it with ink to fill in certain spaces, like you see me doing right now, it kind of blends into the ink, but you can still see the outline. So it creates like the soft finish that I really, really like. And yeah, and another thing I wanted to mention again about this paper and why I love it so much is because this paper specifically allows to do cleaner washes because the ink takes longer to dry. So I'm just gonna get back to that a little bit later because there will be a very good example of that in this illustration later on. But yeah, so as you can see here, the first thing that I did was essentially just pure line work, inked the entire illustration without worrying about any of the darker spots, and then afterwards I'm just filling in bigger washes of color. So the first thing that I did was the hair. I typically just do the hair first, or the face, and the reason for that is that usually I know what the hair color is going to be or what the skin tone is of a character already, and so those are the things that I don't have a ton of choice with, so I'll just do that first. And then as I color in the rest of the illustration, a lot of it tends to be spontaneous. Like in this specific case, I wasn't sure which colors or tones I was going to use where, and I'm kind of just making it up on the spot, and it's easier to do that in relation with things that I have less control over. And so that's why I typically do the hair and skin first. And I do kind of go back and forth a little bit, but once I put down the vast majority of the tone of the hair, that's when I decided to just move on and do some other parts of the illustration. And back in the day, I would do a shadow pass on the entire illustration, but as you can see here, I did put down some shadows in certain places. In this particular case, the decision making was sort of like I decided to leave out those areas to be lighter in tone, or have lighter local colors, so I put some shadows down on those areas. But for the cape, I just went right in, because I knew that I wanted it to be a darker tone, and specifically red, because I thought it might look striking, which I think it kind of does. So for that, I did not bother to shade it, because I have noticed over the years that darker local colors typically cover up a lot of the shadows that I put down with the lighter toned diluted line work color. So it's kind of a waste of time to do it and then cover it up with the darker ink and then to have to basically just do it over again. And so at this point, I have learned to kind of modify my process to cater to that and not waste time. So as you can see here, one of the things that I kind of found interesting that I wanted to mention about doing this cape is that I've really noticed that, okay, so what I did first was put down a wash of clear water. It wasn't exactly clear, but more or less so, in order to do a wet on wet technique. And so for the left hand side of the cape, I used just less water overall. So I don't know if that it's probably pretty clear. So as you can see, the way that the ink spreads, like the wet on wet technique ink spreads, is a little bit different on the right side, because I just happened to use a lot more water. Like there was a lot more water on the brush. The brush was very saturated with water when I used it to put down the initial wash. And so I noticed that the way that the ink interacts with it is very different, and it spreads a lot more rapidly and ends up looking more even. So that's just something I decided to note for myself for the future. When I want to do a wet on wet wash again, I really prefer the look of the wash when I use less water initially. Hopefully that was clear enough. And so that's something I thought might be cool to mention. But yeah, I also realized that I should probably do some more experimentation, because little things like that, you just kind of find out about it on the go. I never really thought about it too much until this happened, and I was like, oh, this looks different, so I guess I decided to take note. So yeah. Anywho, moving on to what I'm doing next, I decided to go in with some darker inks into the hair, because now that I've put the local color down on the cape, suddenly it tonally looked very similar to the hair, and the hair ceased to be the darkest part, even though it's supposed to be. So I decided to just go in and put a lot more darker ink into the hair, and specifically concentrate it around the face, which is something I did for the illustration that I was kind of referencing, which is the suitcase illustration of the same character I did last year that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. And that is the look that I wanted to emulate, because looking back on it, it's still one of my favorite illustrations that I've done. I don't think I managed to recapture the spontaneity of it, obviously, because this was very premeditated with the digital sketch and whatnot. But I still really like the way that this one turned out as well. And, just trying to use the same colors and doing a similar approach really helped. So, yeah. But anyways, as you can see, I'm just elaborating on the hair. And again, when I do this, I do like to experiment a little bit with texture and like what kind of approach I decided to take. And that's one of the best things about drawing traditionally, is that digitally I tend to not experiment nearly as much, because I just kind of use a process that I'm very familiar with. And since digital tools behave in a much more predictable way, it's difficult to come across any sort of happy, accidental, experimental outcomes that often occur when you do things traditionally and take some liberties here and there. So I thought that was something I'd like to share. But anyways, as you can see now, I'm getting into some of the details, and so I'm essentially painting in the boots. And I guess I kind of wanted to mention how I make my decisions generally when it comes to the colors. So I try not to, like, if I have a very basic color scheme that's very limited, like this one. So this one is essentially just a darker brown with a pop of red, and those are the primary colors that I'm using. If you can even say colors, so you could easily say that it's more chromatic with one color accent. That also works. So typically how I tend to approach picking what color or tone to use where is kind of like in a ratioed way. So since the cape takes up a lot of the space within the character's silhouette, I decided that it would be redundant to use that same tone of red anywhere else, really, because then it would just kind of even out the ratio. So it would be like equally dark and equally red, and that 50-50 ratio split, I think, is a little bit dull in my opinion. So in order to avoid that, I decided to stick to different tones in the rest of the illustration. So for the pants, obviously I was not going to make them red, or in order to create contrast, and actually went with the was it with the sepia, with like a diluted sepia ink, because it had a little bit of a cooler tone, and I thought it would create nice contrast within the already constrained color scheme, because the hair has a very warm tone to it. So essentially these are like super fast decisions. I don't linger in it too much, and I will say that a lot of the time the decisions I make don't pan out exactly how I want them to, but there's always something you can do afterwards to kind of get it closer to your initial vision or whatever. So in this specific case, like, I wasn't entirely pre-planning what to do with the pants, so I was being a little experimental, and you see on top I added some blotches of a darker brown color, and I thought it looked kind of interesting, though now that I look at it, it actually kind of looks soiled, which is really funny looking back. But anyways, I don't know, I think later on I added a little more brown to make it look less weird. But yeah, so I decided to add just a little bit of shadow, just a hint of it at the bottom. So as you can see, I added a bunch of dabs of the darker color, and then I added just a touch of form shading on the folds of the pants, and I actually really love how that ended up looking. And it's easier to see the interesting effect at the very end of the video, where I do like an extreme close-up on the pants. Super happy with that, and I think that was one of those happy experimental accidents that I have. I like the contrast a lot of how the shadows are on the warm side and the local color is, or the local tone is, on the cooler side. And yeah, and I kind of decided to retain the relatively flat wash on the rest of the pants, because I just thought that it created more interest. And since there's so many little details in and around that area, like where the suitcase is, or where the with the socks and the shoes, and above with like all the little belts and buttons, I just kind of decided to keep the pants flat, and that leaves the area as a bit of a rest for the eyes when looking around the drawing at all the details. And so after I finished the pants, obviously I had the decision to make on what color I'm going to make the suitcase, and I went with just like a diluted version of the burnt sienna ink, that is the red in this picture. And I do like how it looks. It doesn't steal too much attention, because I want most of the attention to go to the cape, which bright red obviously, and the face, which is why I put so much darkness around her relatively pale face. One thing I'm going to say is that looking back on this now, I don't know if leaving the scarf type of cozy accessory white was the best choice, because the flowers kind of blend into it. But I think that was partially solved by what you're looking at right now, which is me adding some orange just to separate the flowers a little bit from the scarf. And like you can probably tell, like, that's just how I tend to make decisions, you know. I'll just assess the situation and see what might need some fixing and go according to that. I guess looking back, I could have also made the flowers a contrasting color. I thought it was really cute how, I mean, there's, if you can call this a story, I suppose it's like a narrative element, but I've been drawing this bird a lot with HaeJin, and I just have like some thoughts in my head of the fact that this bird just randomly took a liking to her and likes to nest in her hair and follows her around for years. And I thought it was really cute that the bird just kept bringing flowers and putting them into her scarf, and she doesn't really care, and so she just lets it be. That's kind of what she's like. And that's the cute little story element in this drawing, which has nothing to do with anything. But yeah, I don't even know why I decided to mention that, but maybe that's of interest. I guess that kind of goes hand in hand with how I make decisions when making the sketch. So yeah. And so also another thing I wanted to mention, back when I did the initial illustration that I was trying to emulate here, the suitcase one, which I have as a print, by the way, in my shop. But yeah, I did not utilize too many pencils. In fact, I think in that particular illustration, in illustration, I did not use colored pencils at all. But since I've been really loving the colored pencils and the hatching in one direction technique, I just wanted to migrate that over and see how it would look, and I do really like it, and it's something that I'm just planning to use as much as I can going forward. And another thing that I used to do all the time, what you see me doing right now, is giving a pop of color outline to the entire silhouette of the character. I used to do this all the time when I was in high school, when I drew like Sailor Moon type of characters. In fact, I think that's initially where I got the inspiration to do that from in the first place, was to from looking at the Sailor Moon colored illustrations that came along with the manga. And so I still think it's a really cute technique. I think Naoko Takeuchi, the Sailor Moon manga creator, illustrator, whatever, she probably got this idea from Alphonse Mucha, which is a much older artist, and I can see a lot of like Art Nouveau inspiration in her art and the way that she did Sailor Moon illustrations. So I think that just kind of migrated to some of the choices that I make as well. But yeah, I'm currently in the midst of working on a very exciting collaborative project, and I'll tell you guys more about it soon. But I hope you enjoyed listening to the process of this illustration, and if you wanted to support me, please check out my shop. There's a link below, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!